Good evening, adventurers. Today's tale follows a problem player who compulsively cheats, even as early as character creation, and for out-of-game personal reasons the Dungeon Master felt that they couldn't kick the player. The following tale is the journey up until the player cheated so brazenly that it was far too obvious. Let's get into it. Tonight's tale is called The Apotheosis of a Peacock, the Downfall of a Compulsive Cheater. In this story, the problem player is a 30-something-year-old man, and his character's supposedly chaotic good. The first red flag appeared before the very first session of their very first campaign, when the player gave his level 1 character stats that were all 16 and above, 3 of them 20s, as well as several rare magical items. This included Dawnbreaker, because, as the player argued, his Dragonborn fighter's name was Kralis Dawnscream, and he should have a sword that matched his surname. The Dungeon Master told him he should have followed her character creation instructions, and then lowered the stats to more appropriate levels. She'll let him keep the magic items, but only if Kralis developed an allergy to magic. In fact, she insisted upon it. The Dungeon Master hoped this would teach him a lesson to not mess with his character sheet. After a few days, he finally begged her to remove both the allergy and the magic items, and she let him redo his sheet. This time, the right way. Within a couple of days, he had changed it again. Old Kralis was back to having several stats soar into 20. The Dungeon Master told the player that she'll only let him keep his strength and constitution at that level. But since the most logical explanation for a level 1 character to be this buff was serious steroid abuse, his wisdom was now 3 as a result of Kralis' constant roid rage. Thus, he became a mound of muscle that could deal a ton of damage, but only see and hit things that were directly in front of him. Anyway, that campaign is its own story, but during the course of it, the player tried to bump his stats up at least once more. So the Dungeon Master made it a routine of checking his sheets every week, at the very least to discourage him from doing it more. Another noteworthy thing, the player liked to boast, and boast often, about what a strong and intimidating character Kralis was. But when it came to actual combat, however, he would refuse to do anything that involved risk. You've got to jump over that 5x6 ditch to reach the flame skull that has the rogue pinned. The warlock and the sorcerer are surrounded by a dozen skeletons. Oh wait, now the sorcerer is 1v1 with a ghost? Kralis would shrug and say, "Looks like they have it handled," and then just walk away. Out of game, the player enthused about his powerful character build, always raving over the theory of Kralis and not the reality of him, the fighter that wouldn't fight. Some of the group were planning to attend PAX Unplugged, and the Dungeon Master asked if anyone would want her to do a one-shot there. The problem player was one of those that said yes. He was a mutual acquaintance of online friends, and so she had only ever played tabletop with him online. This would be the first time in person. Part of PAX Unplugged is a lending library of board games that people are allowed to check and test out. In every single game the group played that weekend, this player cheated. Every single one. His behaviour included constantly keeping cards instead of discarding them, hiding cards, faking dice rolls, standing up and pretending to stretch to look at other people's hands, or outright walking behind them to peer over their shoulder, using his watch to reflect a card in a Guess Who type game, and oh, so much more. It was unreal how relentlessly he cheated, almost as if it was a compulsion. Someone would call him out on one thing, to which he would go, "Oh, whoops," but then do the exact same thing a couple of minutes later, even with everyone staring at him. He tried to mask his cheating by pretending to be forgetful or not knowing the rules. This behaviour carried over into the Dungeons & Dragons one-shot. He kept faking his dice rolls. The DM would see out of the corner of her eye as he slid the dice over to the number side he wanted, use his hands to mime the motion of rolling it, then declare the result. At one point, his character's spear was depreciated by acid, so the DM told him to write down that it now did less damage. She watched him pick up a pencil and pretend to write, then put the pencil back down without making any marks whatsoever on the paper. She tried calling him out when she could, but his behaviour was so constant that if she reprimanded every single instance, it would have derailed the game and spoiled the experience of everybody else at the table. The Dungeon Master was indignant and vowed to never play another game with this guy again. Afterwards, word got back around to the player and he profusely apologised to the Dungeon Master, admitting he had an extremely unhealthy need to win. She told him the point of playing games isn't to win, but to have fun, and his friends aren't his competitors or rivals to defeat. They're his friends. The player promised he would never cheat again. That behaviour wasn't who he really was as a person, and he would be different from then on. The Dungeon Master was dubious. She was getting another campaign geared up, however, and to get some of the people she wanted on board together, she also had to invite him. So she gave him another chance. Thus, Kralis Dawnscream returned. In the previous campaign, he somehow had gotten himself into a romantic relationship with both a succubus and a doppelganger. After one of their threesomes, Kralis went and washed himself in a spring that he knew beforehand was sacred to Saloon, desecrating it in the process. From then on, he would receive signs and omens that the goddess was gunning for him, but scoffing, declared he would never ever apologise to her. Anyway, in this new campaign, Kralis was accompanied by the baby of the succubus and doppelganger that he was tasked to take care of. The baby was a DMPC and the party paladin, since no one was interested in playing a dedicated healer. Kralis's player was really into the Mandalorian at the time, and the DM had hoped the baby would get him more invested into role-playing. Previously, he didn't do much beyond participating in threesomes and accidentally destroying the village of Phandelver. The player lost interest in Kralis after 2 or 3 sessions, and he kept forgetting the baby and leaving it in buildings and alleyways. So the Dungeon Master suggested that Kralis could go off on a journey somewhere, to a place where he could study mindfulness and work on increasing his wisdom from 3. A yoga retreat would do the trick. Meanwhile, she would allow the player to switch in his character from the PAX Unplugged one-off, an Aarakocra monk cleric named Zyrkek Ragewing. The DM needed to come up with a token for this character, and seeing as the player had never bothered to pick one out himself, she went looking. The only description the player had provided for the Aarakocra's appearance was purple. She looked at the available options, owls, hawks, hummingbirds, etc. Then she saw the perfect one and smiled. It would not be difficult at all to get purple from peacock blue. The player really liked the idea of a giant man peacock, saying it would accentuate Zyrkek's flirtiness. A moment of silence is in order here. For this cleric character's deity, the player had picked some random homebrew god that was barely a fleshed out rip-off of an Elder Scrolls Daedra, albeit a gormless little girl version of it. This was fine for the one-off, but for a campaign the Dungeon Master wanted something that would be a little more substantial, and preferably give her away, if needed, to rein his character in. She told him to pick a new god. After a few seconds of lazy searching, he shrugged and said he would just do one of the major good ones. A tad perturbed at his lack of effort, but not surprised, she told him that honestly, she really doesn't think he's capable of worshipping anybody or anything other than himself. In fact, as a cleric, why doesn't Zyrkek worship himself as his own god? The player asked. He would serve only himself? Exactly, replied the Dungeon Master. Oh, the logistics wouldn't be that hard to hammer out, she assured him. Suppose the other gods were fearful and jealous of Zyrkek, so they plotted against him. First they locked him inside a mortal shell, an Aarakocra on account of their very short lifespans, and then threw his infant incarnation before gnolls to ensure he was eliminated. But Zyrkek showed them. He survived and thrived amongst the gnolls, and learned there was still a tendril of power within him connecting to his divinity. Not dead, but dormant. Only by praying to himself could his sleeping godhood hear and help. So in order to cast spells and access cleric powers, Zyrkek must beseech his own blessing and sing his own praises. The player immediately, enthusiastically agreed. Now, what on earth would Zyrkek be the god of? The DM mulled. The player did not answer for quite some time, so the DM ventured a suggestion. How about mirrors and reflections? He would seemingly be a minor god, but if it worked a lot like DC Comics' Mirror Master, his power would belie appearances. The player said sure, and right then and there wanted to start adding mirror teleportation powers to his character sheet. The DM gently shook her head, however, and told him that at level 6, Zyrkek needed to work up to them first. Thus, the giant, scantily clad purple peacock monk cleric joined the party, introduced as Kralis' very, very close tent buddy from his mercenary troop, the player nodding his assent to this description. Zyrkek came to house-sit Kralis' things whilst the Dragonborn journeyed to his yoga retreat in order to learn how to eat, pray and love. As Kralis stood before the open road, Only one of the other party members, the Tabaxi fighter, came out to wave goodbye to him. The rest sat inside their house in their respective rooms, waiting for him to leave. Kralis took a step, the very first step on the quest to find himself. The sky grew dark, the morning sun blocked by a blood moon. Apparently this was rather unremarkable to Kralis and his player, who didn't give a reaction and just kept trudging on. This will be the last time Kralis Dawnscream was ever seen alive. In Zyrkek's first outing, the player seemed to enjoy himself. The party was tasked with breaking into a safe in an upscale residence that happened to have 3 daughters, all debutantes. The plan was for the half-elf warlock to pose as a gentleman caller. He was picked since the rest of the party consisted of anthropomorphic animals, a robot and a baby, and distract the family whilst everyone else snuck in and did the stealing. As an Aarakocra, Zyrkek was supposed to be the warlock's wingman. When they walked through the front door, Zyrkek immediately pushed the warlock to the side and shouldered into the room with the ladies, unfurling his giant peacock tail to block the warlock from entering behind him. An actual peacock block. The 3 girls gawped at him, and that's when the party realised only one of them was 18, the others underage. The warlock whispered to just focus on the 18-year-old, but Zyrkek smirked and said he's technically a 3-year-old, they're all available to him. The rest of the mission he spent playing a liar, while dropping terrible one-liners, hypnotising the girls with his tail feathers, and at one point casting the command spell on the 14-year-old to force her to stop crying from the sensory overload. This emerged as a trend for Zyrkek. He never used the command spell on enemies, only on young women in a position of vulnerability. For instance, the party had come upon a little girl in distress from seeing her friends die in an explosion. She had found the necklace of fireballs that had caused it, but was still in shock too much to let it go. Not even attempting to console her, Zyrkek used command to force her to give it to him. The DM noticed this pattern of his and decided to test and see how far he would go. The 18-year-old debutante showed up at the party's house, still enamoured of Zyrkek. She'd run away from her parents, she said, and wanted to become his high priestess. She fell to his feet and grovelled at them, praying and worshipping. At this, he started laughing. He began ordering her around, forcing her to do tiny trivial tasks just to watch her obey him. He cackled even more when she picked up a knife and began to carve a Z into her forehead. Only after the other party members objected did he use the command spell to force her to stop. Gleefully he told her, "You're only allowed to do that when I order you to." The next session the girl was gone. The DM explained it away, saying she had gotten sent to finishing school by a concerned NPC. That was the extent of Zyrkek's interactions with most NPCs. He never bothered to talk to the friendly ones unless they were young women. And the enemies he barely engaged in battle with, preferring to fly around on the outskirts of combat. As a cleric, the only person he would ever heal was himself. On these occasions, the DM made him go through the full motions of pulling out his holy symbol, a little hand mirror that he had to gaze into to glimpse his divine self gazing back, and praying a lengthy prayer to himself in order to cast the spell. And this whole campaign thus far, despite his previous promises, the player did not stop attempting to cheat. He at least learned by now not to rejigger his stats, but during fights he would either forget to reduce his HP when damaged, to the point that the DM just did it herself, or try to add more when he thought the DM was occupied, apparently not realising the website they used allowed the Dungeon Master to see all health bars at once, and any changes made to them in real time. When one session ended after a big fight, everybody was able to level up, but since they had not taken a long rest, the DM told them to keep their health the same. She was going to give them a rest when they reconvened, but she wanted to see who would follow directions, specifically the problem player. Throughout the next week, she would periodically check on the game to monitor health levels. They all stayed the same till about 30 minutes before the next session started. Zyrkek's player snuck in to bring his character back up to full health, left, and then came back in after everyone else arrived, pretending to be late. The DM called him out on his antics, repeatedly, but nonetheless he continued. On top of that, with each week the player became more and more disrespectful. He kept joking that he was just going to play The Witcher 3 instead of showing up for sessions, and sometimes music from the game could be heard over his mic. He was always insinuating that the DM herself was cheating on her own dice rolls. She had anticipated he would project his own behaviour onto her, as narcissists are wont to do. So she always used the site's 3D dice roller and was open about her rolls, only keeping some NPC perception checks hidden. And his character did little more than show up, barely contributed to combat or roleplay, except of course when emotionally vulnerable young women were in the vicinity. and from some of the things he would say, it became more and more clear to the Dungeon Master that the player considered her, since she was the Dungeon Master, as the big bad of the game. The cheating was him thinking he was outwitting her, the final boss monster, thereby besting her and becoming the winner of Dungeons and Dragons. Needless to say, the DM was very tired of it all, but the player was chummy with most of the other people in the group. Up to this point, his cheating consisted of hundreds of little things that he would wave off as him just forgetting, or he simply pretended to be stupid. Far too many sessions would start with him saying, "Guys, I forgot how to play the game again." The Dungeon Master knew that he was no idiot, just egotistical, which in a way is simulated idiocy. To kick him out without others leaving, he had to do something big and blatant, something he couldn't possibly justify. He was capable of it. She'd seen it in person at PAX Unplugged. She just had to watch and wait. At the end of one session, the same one it so happens that saw Zyrkek laughing at the 18-year-old girl, carving his initial into her forehead, the party was in a new section of the city, tracking down a nimble right. From a nearby alley stepped out a beautiful red-headed woman, just drop-dead gorgeous. She had wild curly hair, freckles, and a look of fierceness, very evocative of, well, Triss Merigold from the Witcher series. In fact, why? She looked exactly like Triss. Zyrkek shot straight towards her, landing and unfurling his big peacock tail to trap her in the alley. Her eyebrows and everyone else's shot up. She looked him up and down incredulously, then told him that he really wasn't her type. Zyrkek leaned in and smirked. "That's what they all say at first." Here, the half-elf warlock ran up to valiantly try and defuse the situation, asking politely for her name, and what landmarks can be found in this section of town. The woman, still staring at Zyrkek, gestured behind her. "He's more my type. And by the way, the name's Catty Bree." A drow with 2 scimitars stepped out from the shadows behind her. End of session. 1 week. 1 whole week. All that time, Zyrkek's player had to research and strategize on how to deal with this development, and he did indeed spend some of it reading up on this character. When the next session started, the player revealed his master plan. Zyrkek's mouth opened, and a stream of racial slurs about drow started pouring out. Everybody's jaws dropped. His intention, his conceit, was that by spouting about how awful and terrible drow are, he could goad this one into not attacking Zyrkek, and thereby avoid stereotypical drow behaviour. He tried to insult Drizzt Do'Urden with racial slurs into not beating him up. Drizzt ran at him, and Zyrkek engaged his classic tactic of flying off to stick to the outskirts of combat. Away the peacock man flew, gloating over how Drizzt couldn't possibly reach him. Suddenly, a black panther materialised above him. It grappled Zyrkek, the weight of it dragging him down to the ground where Drizzt awaited. The scimitars began wailing into the birdman, blood and feathers everywhere. While this was going on, the half-elf warlock found the other companions of the hall. With Regis, he rolled an extremely high persuasion check to help him stop the fight. The 2 of them ran around back and forth between the others to enlist their aid as well. Several successful persuasion checks later, the group of them together managed to convince Drizzt that Zyrkek wasn't worth his time, and he had better things to do. They all walk off, leaving Zyrkek a bloody mess on the ground with 2 HP. The only reason he was still alive was because of that warlock and Drizzt getting 3 threes in a row in his attack rolls. Zyrkek took this as further evidence of his divinity. The nimble-right the party had been looking for jumped out just then, and plucked one of the peacock man's tail feathers, reducing him to 0 HP and promptly knocking him out. During this entire encounter, the player still had been massaging his health meter, but again, nothing obvious that couldn't be explained away by him being an idiot. The next week there was no session since it was PAX East. Most of the group would be attending, including the Dungeon Master and the problem player. The Dungeon Master was there to enjoy herself, and not interested in any drama whatsoever. She did put in a genuine effort to be cordial. A good time seemed to be had. Could there possibly be hope for this player? The next session after everyone returned, only a couple of hours before the start, Zyrkek's player texted the group chat he will not be able to attend. His wording went this way. A streamer friend of his really needed help running her stream that night, and he had promised her he could do it, because he's such a helpful guy, but unfortunately he's just way too helpful for his own good. And oh no, he had overpromised himself yet again, trying to be helpful to as many people as possible, and so unfortunately won't be able to make it to that night's D&D session after all. The DM asked him what the streamer needed help with. The player immediately changed his story, saying, he had promised the streamer that he would be there to support her. One of the other players then reprimanded him, so he backpedaled further. You know what, he said, it's going to be really tough, but he thinks he can juggle his commitments to be able to make it. The DM then asked him that since he wasn't going to be there to help, would the streamer even be able to manage to stream by herself? To this, he finally admitted that the streamer was just going to make a Sims version of himself, and he wanted to watch. The DM was far more offended at this series of insultingly stupid excuses than whether or not he had actually shown up. If he had simply said at the start he wasn't able to attend, no explanation needed, she would have been perfectly fine with that. Life can be crazy. People do not need to explain themselves to her. If they do feel the need to, she preferred they be honest and didn't belittle her intelligence by dressing it up as some altruistic urge. The ensuing session began as the Paladin's baby's first birthday party, but quickly became a big barroom brawl. It started with the arrival of the baby's parents, the succubus and the doppelganger, also known as Kralis' threesome buddies. A box in hand and singing happy birthday, they lifted the lid and poured out their present to their child, building blocks made from the cubed flesh of Kralis. A slugfest erupted, and since they were stuck indoors, Zyrkek couldn't do his typical little flying away tactic. Being the succubus's true love, the doppelganger now was also a vampire. At one point in the fight, it filled the room with swarms of bats. Zyrkek tried to fly through this to actually, for the very first time ever, heal another player. He probably, though, just wanted to distance himself from the succubus. Dozens of opportunity attacks by dozens of bats later, his health was very low. The player was messing with Zyrkek's HP count so much during this that the Dungeon Master had to lock him out of readjusting it. Someone used the web spell to snare all of the bats. Despite Dex being his highest stat, Zyrkek failed the saving throw and got caught in it too. Another player lit the web on fire to burn the bats. Zyrkek continued to fail every single saving throw to escape. The peacock was trapped. His arms held aloft by the web in a Christ-like pose. The flames wreathed his form. When a god burns, is it holy fire? Then the problem player did it. The big thing. He had a potion of healing on him and declared he was going to down it. 19 health back, he exclaimed. The DM narrowed her eyes. 19 from 2d4 plus 2? She asked him where the roll was. He said it wasn't on the screen. He had used his physical dice to roll it. If the player so wanted her to be the bad guy, well, she can certainly be the bad guy. The Dungeon Master showed her hand and employed the loophole she had given herself with the player's own permission. When the player had agreed to his cleric worshipping himself as his own deity, he had also given his assent to the premise that the other gods, out of fear and jealousy, banded together to bring Zyrkek down. That is, every single god in the Forgotten Realms hates Zyrkek so much, to such a degree, that they put aside all of their considerable differences with one another to unite against him. From now on, every time the player cheats, a D100 roll will determine which god will descend to battle Zyrkek in hand-to-hand combat. When Zyrkek dies, the god might then be inclined to resurrect him. The story reason being that they wish for him to have a continued capacity for suffering. This will last until the player has stopped cheating for an extended period of time. The only way the player can continue in the campaign is under this condition. The player quit. He did not even try to defend himself. Everybody else stayed. Story-wise, Zyrkek's disappearance was explained as him befalling a fate reminiscent to Narcissus. While praying to himself in his mirror, he got lost in his own reflection. Now he wanders his divine realm, the mirror maze, the only denizens of which are the thousands upon thousands of instances of his own image within its walls. And there we have it. Well, I believe we can all appreciate the sentiment behind the Dungeon Master feeling unable to just outright kick the player. The details of the reason aren't stated fully, but surely we can all imagine a scenario in which just kicking a player would be difficult. But holding your tongue for this long when the player is cheating in front of you is a feat in of itself. This story really highlighted to me how lucky I am to have a group of players who, for one, don't ever cheat, and for two, would 100% be on my side if any one of them was cheating to the degree that this player was. If we trust the story, the problem player certainly only played their character in a way that was reflective of a reputation they perhaps wanted for themselves in real life, which is to say an unstoppable badass who was a complete hit with the ladies, who would swoon and fawn over him at a whim, as evidenced by his nature in combat of protecting his own character in order to preserve the aura of badassery that had been self-applied and nobody else was buying. But you have to have a dream, I suppose. Have you ever seen a player cheat like this? Was there any fallout? That's all I have for tonight. But remember, the tavern is always open. Good night.